If you feel lost without panic, something already shifted. This does not register as relief or clarity, and it does not arrive with a sense of having figured anything out. It shows up as the absence of urgency where urgency used to live. The familiar tension that once pushed you to locate direction, meaning, or next steps is no longer active, and nothing rushed in to replace it. You may notice the word lost appearing in your mind, but without the emotional charge that usually accompanies it. There is no scramble to fix the feeling and no pressure to escape it. This is not numbness and not avoidance. It is a quiet neutrality that remains even as orientation drops away. The system is not signaling danger. It is not asking for intervention. Experience continues without demanding a map. This is why the lack of panic matters more than the lack of direction. Panic would indicate threat. Its absence indicates that whatever once required constant orientation has already completed its role. You did not step into this intentionally. You did not choose to let go of direction. The need for direction simply stopped organizing perception. What remains feels unfamiliar, only because it does not match the patterns you were trained to recognize as stability. And yet beneath the unfamiliarity there is no alarm. That absence is not accidental, it is functional. There is an important difference between being lost because something collapsed and being lost because something ended. Collapse carries fear, urgency, and a demand for immediate repair. Ending carries quiet, space, and a lack of insistence. When collapse happens, the system reacts. When an ending happens, the system settles. If panic is not present, then collapse is not what occurred. The body is not mobilized, attention is not scanning for threat. Thought may still attempt to label the situation as a problem, but the body does not support that interpretation. This distinction matters because it changes how the state should be understood. Loss with panic requires correction. Loss without panic does not. It indicates that the structures that once provided orientation are no longer needed for functioning. The mind may still expect distress to arrive, as if being without direction must eventually become unbearable. But the expected distress does not come. The system continues to operate. Days move forward. Decisions still happen. Nothing breaks. This is not because direction will return later. It is because direction is no longer required to maintain coherence. What feels like being lost is actually the absence of a framework that no longer serves, and the calm that accompanies it is the clearest signal that this is not a problem waiting to be solved, but a shift that has already stabilized. The sense of orientation that once organized your inner life did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it finished doing what it was meant to do. Earlier structures gave shape to decisions, identity, and time. They helped you move, choose, and understand yourself through contrast and direction. When those structures were necessary, their presence felt natural. When they stopped being necessary, they did not announce their departure. They simply lost relevance. You may notice memories of how you used to think about your life, your goals, or your trajectory, but those references no longer generate traction. They do not pull you forward or backward. They sit quietly, without demand. This can feel like disorientation, but it is a specific kind. It is not confusion caused by lack of information. It is the absence of a map that no longer corresponds to the territory. The mind may still reach for familiar coordinates, trying to locate where you are in relation to where you were going, but those coordinates no longer organize experience. The old orientation ended, and nothing rushed in to replace it. That is not a failure of transition. It is the transition completing itself. What you are experiencing is not the loss of direction, but the end of a directional system that no longer needs to run in the background. Often, when direction drops away, the mind expects panic to follow. It anticipates urgency, anxiety, or some internal collapse that will force a reorientation. That expectation itself comes from an older pattern where disorientation meant danger. But here, the expected reaction does not arrive. The system does not escalate. There is no spike in fear, no tightening in the body, no frantic attempt to regain control. This absence can be confusing because it contradicts what you were taught to expect. You may notice the mind waiting for panic, almost testing whether it will appear later. But it does not. The body remains calm, attention stays present. Nothing demands immediate correction. This is not because you are suppressing fear or bypassing something uncomfortable. It is because the situation is not being registered as a threat. When the nervous system does not signal alarm, it means coherence is intact. The lack of panic is not a delay before a problem emerges. It is the indicator that a deeper shift has already occurred. The system recognizes that there is nothing to fix, even if the mind has not yet adjusted its interpretation. And that gap between expectation and reality is where the new stability becomes apparent. What you may be encountering now is a form of not knowing that does not produce suffering. There is space where certainty used to be, but that space is not experienced as lack. It feels neutral, almost unremarkable. You are not driven to fill it with explanation or purpose. The absence of direction does not create pressure to invent one. This is a significant distinction. When disorientation is threatening, it demands resolution. When it is not, it can be lived inside without resistance. You may notice that the word lost still appears, but it no longer activates urgency. It is descriptive rather than alarming. This state often gets misinterpreted because most models equate not knowing with instability. Here, not knowing is simply what remains when the compulsion to know has dissolved. There is no emotional spike asking you to correct it. Days continue without friction. You function without having to define what this phase means. The lack of suffering is not avoidance. It is evidence that the system is not perceiving danger. Nothing inside is bracing for collapse. That neutrality is the signal. It indicates that the pause you are in is not transitional in the usual sense. It is functional. It does not need to be framed as temporary in order to be tolerable. It stands on its own without requiring interpretation. Even as this neutrality settles, the mind may continue to generate familiar alerts. Thoughts may arise suggesting that something should feel wrong, that uncertainty should hurt more, that you should be more concerned. These signals are not commands. They are echoes from an earlier operating system that relied on anxiety to maintain momentum. They appear because the mind has learned to associate lack of direction with risk. But those alerts no longer carry authority. They surface and pass without escalating into action. You do not need to argue with them or resolve them. The body does not support their urgency. There is no physiological backing to turn them into fear. This is how you can tell they are residual. They reference conditions that are no longer active. The system is not mobilizing around them. The absence of panic is not accidental. It is structural. It shows that the mind is speaking from memory while the body is responding to what is actually happening. And what is happening is stability without orientation. The alerts lose traction because there is nothing for them to organize. They fade not because you silence them, but because the environment they depend on no longer exists. The body often makes this clear before the mind accepts it. There is no baseline tension preparing for what comes next. Breathing remains steady without needing correction. Muscles are not held in anticipation. Posture does not signal readiness or collapse. Even when uncertainty is present, the body does not respond as if something is wrong. This matters more than any interpretation the mind produces. The nervous system is not mobilized. There is no fight or flight response waiting to activate. Stress may appear in specific situations, but it does not linger or generalize. Recovery happens naturally, without effort. This tells you that the loss of direction is not being registered as danger. When the body is calm in the absence of orientation, it means the system already trusts the present moment to be sufficient. That trust is not emotional and not chosen. It is functional. The body does not need a plan to remain regulated. It is no longer bracing for a future it must prepare for. This is why the state you are in does not feel dramatic. It feels plain. And that plainness is the clearest indication that something fundamental has already shifted. Along with this bodily calm, time begins to lose its grip as a reference point. Days move forward without being measured against where they should be leading. Waiting does not feel like delay. Pauses do not imply stagnation. The sense of being behind quietly dissolves because there is no longer a destination pulling experience forward. You may notice that the future does not exert the same pressure it once did. Plans can exist without urgency. Decisions can wait without anxiety. Time is no longer used to evaluate whether you are on track. It simply passes. This does not create emptiness. It creates space. Space without tension. Nothing feels postponed. Nothing feels at risk of being missed. The present does not need to justify itself by pointing somewhere else. This shift in your relationship to time is subtle, but it is decisive. It confirms that the absence of direction is not a problem. It is the absence of a demand that no longer applies. And when that demand falls away, time stops being something you need to manage. As this settles, the way you meet decisions begins to change without effort. Choices no longer carry the same psychological weight they once did. There is less internal debate, less anticipation of consequences, less need to justify why one option is chosen over another. Decisions happen closer to the moment they belong to. They are not rehearsed in advance or revisited afterward. This does not mean you stop considering outcomes. It means consideration no longer defines your state. The absence of panic allows action to arise without being framed as a step toward resolution. You may notice that even when you do not know what comes next, you are still able to respond to what is in front of you. Nothing freezes, nothing collapses. Function continues without a map. This is one of the clearest signs that something has already shifted. When direction is gone but action remains intact, it means orientation is no longer required for coherence. The system does not need to know where it is going in order to move when movement is needed. Decisions become simple, not because they are trivial, but because they are no longer asked to carry identity or future security. Alongside this change in decision-making, reality itself feels less demanding. Situations no longer arrive as tests you must pass or signals you must interpret correctly. The world does not feel like it is waiting for you to align with it. There is less friction, less sense of resistance, less pressure to respond in a particular way. This is not because circumstances have improved. It is because nothing inside is pushing against them. When panic is absent, reality does not need to react. It does not escalate or provoke. Interactions unfold without strain. Outcomes clarify without force. When something needs to happen, it happens. When it does not, there is no impulse to insist. The environment feels neutral, not passive and not active, simply responsive. You are no longer negotiating with what is occurring. You are meeting it directly. And in that directness, there is a quiet ease. The absence of direction does not create conflict with the world. It simplifies the relationship with it. What once felt like pressure dissolves into straightforward participation. As this ease becomes familiar, the sense of who you are begins to loosen without effort. Identity no longer feels like something that needs to be constructed, refined, or protected. There is less internal narration about where you stand or what this phase says about you. You are not forming a new self to replace the old one. The old orientation simply stops asking to be maintained. Action no longer serves self-definition, it serves what is present. You may notice that you explain yourself less, not because you are withholding, but because explanation is no longer required to feel coherent. Being without direction does not threaten identity, because identity is no longer anchored to trajectory. There is no internal character that needs to be moving somewhere in order to be valid. This can feel strangely empty at first, but the emptiness does not hurt. It does not ask to be filled, it functions. Identity becomes operational rather than narrative. You respond as needed without referencing who you are becoming. Nothing is being lost here. What dissolves is the effort of carrying a version of yourself forward. What remains is lighter because it no longer needs to justify itself through progress. Within this, the experience of not knowing settles into something stable. The absence of answers does not register as a gap. It becomes part of how life is lived. You may realize that you are no longer trying to turn uncertainty into insight. You are no longer asking what this means or where it leads. Not knowing stops being a problem and becomes a condition that does not interfere with functioning. This is where the shift becomes unmistakable. When the mind no longer rushes to resolve uncertainty and the body remains calm inside it, the state is no longer transitional. It is integrated. You are not waiting for direction to return. You are not preparing for clarity. You are living without the assumption that either is required. This does not feel elevated or special. It feels ordinary in a deeper sense. The system is no longer oriented around resolution. It is oriented around presence without narrative, and that orientation does not feel like orientation at all. It feels like the absence of pressure to be anywhere else. What integrates next is the recognition that not knowing no longer needs to resolve into knowing. The space that remains is not a pause before clarity and not a waiting room for direction. It is a functional state where nothing is missing. You may notice that the impulse to frame this as a phase weakens. There is less interest in labeling where you are or tracking what comes after. The absence of panic makes this possible. Without fear, there is no urgency to convert uncertainty into meaning. The system is not asking for reassurance, it is already operating. This is why the sense of being lost does not progress into confusion. It stays neutral. It does not deepen or intensify. It does not demand explanation. It simply remains as openness without threat. You are no longer oriented toward finding solid ground because the need for solid ground has dissolved. Experience does not wobble without a map. It steadies. This is the point where many people expect something to happen, some return of direction or emergence of insight, but nothing arrives and nothing needs to. The state does not evolve into something else because it is not incomplete. The absence of direction is not temporary here. It is no longer registered as a lack, it is registered as enough. There is nothing to close and nothing to carry forward from this. No conclusion would improve what is already stable. If you are here, you are not meant to extract a lesson or apply what has been described. The shift did not happen because of these words, and it does not depend on remembering them. What changed is already functioning without reference. The feeling of being lost without panic is not a signal that something needs to be found. It is the signal that the need to find has ended. Nothing is broken. Nothing is delayed. Nothing needs to be recovered. Direction may return in practical forms when it is required, but it will not return as a psychological demand. And until then, there is no problem to solve. This is not an opening and not an invitation. It is a confirmation that something already settled quietly and without announcement. From here, nothing needs to be done.